History Secrets.
There is a moment in history when an empire ceases to be invincible, yet still does not realize it. It was exactly this hypothesis that began to gain traction when Professor Jung, known for applying game theory to geopolitics, presented a prediction that at first glance seemed too bold. He not only anticipated a domestic political victory in the United States, but also stated that the country would go to war with Iran and lose. Today, with the first signs of this conflict emerging, the question is no longer whether this prediction was radical. The question is whether it might be correct. The analysis starts from a simple but deeply uncomfortable point. This is not a conventional war. It is a war of attrition, where time, cost, and resilience matter more than raw power. According to this view, Iran did not enter this scenario unprepared. On the contrary, for more than 2 decades, the country has been structuring its strategy with a specific focus on this type of confrontation, not only in the military field, but also in the psychological, economic, and ideological domains. Within Iran's own internal narrative, this conflict is interpreted as something greater than geopolitics. It is seen as a war against a symbolic enemy, an adversary that represents a global order to be challenged. This dimension completely changes the level of commitment involved. And perhaps this is exactly where the first asymmetry emerges. While the United States operates within political cycles and internal pressures, Iran operates within a long-term strategic horizon, where immediate losses can be acceptable if they contribute to the structural exhaustion of the opponent. This difference in mindset begins to reflect on the battlefield. In recent conflicts, forces aligned with Iran had the opportunity to directly observe American and Israeli military capabilities, not only in theory, but in real practice. This allowed rapid adjustments, tactical learning, and refinement of strategies. And the result begins to appear in a silent, yet consistent way. The war ceases to be direct and starts to target sensitive points of the global system: energy infrastructure, trade routes, supply of essential resources. The focus is not only on winning battles, but on creating instability. A critical example of this approach lies in the structural dependence of Gulf countries. Entire regions depend on highly vulnerable systems, such as desalination plants, responsible for a large portion of water supply. The destruction of a single facility can trigger a chain collapse. And here emerges a data point that completely changes the perception of scale. In many cases, the cost of an attack is negligible compared to the impact generated. Relatively cheap drones can compromise structures that sustain millions of people. This logic redefines the concept of military superiority. It is no longer about who has more technology, but who can impose greater exhaustion at lower cost. At the same time, another element comes into play: control of strategic routes. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a large portion of global energy flow passes, becomes a decisive pressure point. Any disruption there affects not only countries in the region, but the entire global economy. And this creates a cascading effect. The Gulf countries highly dependent on these routes begin to face existential risks, not only economic, but structural. And here, an even deeper connection emerges. These same nations are responsible for financially fueling critical sectors of the American economy, especially when it comes to investments in technology and artificial intelligence. If this flow is interrupted, the impact will not be localized. It spreads. The so-called tech bubble becomes directly dependent on the stability of regions that are now under constant threat. This raises an uncomfortable hypothesis. Perhaps this war is not being fought only on the military field, but in the heart of the global financial system. And if that is true, the conflict ceases to be regional. It becomes structural. The question, then, is no longer who will win on the battlefield, but which system will be able to survive the exhaustion. There is a persistent illusion in modern conflicts that technological superiority guarantees victory. But in certain scenarios, this same technology becomes a weakness. What begins to emerge in this conflict is an asymmetry that is difficult to ignore. On one side, extremely sophisticated systems, designed over decades, with high costs and complex operations. On the other, simple, cheap, and highly replicable solutions. And this difference is not only technical, it is structural. when a single ballistic missile requires multiple interceptors to be neutralized, and each interceptor costs dozens of times more than the target, the economic balance of war begins to break. It is no longer about defensive capability. It is about sustainability. If the cost of defense is higher than the cost of attack, time starts working against the side with more resources. This inversion completely alters strategic logic. For decades, the American military apparatus was built on a specific paradigm, a model inherited from the post-World War II era, shaped by the Cold War, where demonstrating technological superiority was an essential part of deterrence. But this model was designed for another type of war, a war of power display, technological race, strategic symbolism, not necessarily a prolonged war of continuous attrition. And it is exactly this type of conflict that we are entering in. The consequences of this begin to appear in a way that is almost imperceptible, yet profoundly significant. The so-called aura of invincibility, built over decades, begins to fragment, not through a direct defeat, but through a sequence of small signals that, when combined, indicate vulnerability. And when this perception changes, the impact goes far beyond the military field. Global confidence in a power does not depend only on its real strength, but on the perception of that strength. When that perception shifts, alliances begin to be reassessed. Markets react, and strategic decisions start to be made based on a new scenario. It is at this point that a possible historical transition emerges. The idea of a single hegemony begins to give way to a more fragmented, more distributed, more unpredictable world, a multipolar world. And this transition does not happen in an organized way. It happens under tension. At the same time, another variable comes into play: resource exhaustion. In modern wars, it is not only soldiers who become exhausted. Entire systems do. Munitions, interceptors, supply chains. Every launch, every defense, every response carries a cost that must be sustained over time. And when that cost accumulates, it begins to impose limits. If replenishment does not keep up with the pace of consumption, operational capacity deteriorates. And this creates a dangerous scenario. Because as options decrease, more radical decisions begin to emerge. Among them, one of the most delicate: the use of ground troops. Historically, regime changes have never been achieved exclusively through air power. There is a limit to what can be done from a distance. And this limit inevitably leads to the need for physical presence. But this move carries enormous risk. Not only military, but political. Public opinion, especially in democracies, tends to resist prolonged conflicts with high human cost. And in this specific case, there are clear signs that a large portion of the population does not support an escalation of this kind. This creates a dilemma. On one hand, there is external pressure from strategic allies who directly depend on intervention. On the other, there is internal resistance. And in the middle of this, decisions must be made. If ground troops are deployed, the conflict enters a new phase. A phase where the cost is no longer only financial, but human. And historically, this type of transition rarely occurs without deep consequences. At the same time, there is an alternative, albeit controversial: indirect negotiation. The attempt to contain the situation through concessions. But this option also carries a cost. It may be interpreted as weakness. And in a scenario where perception is already being questioned, this may further accelerate the loss of global influence. What makes this situation particularly complex is that there is no simple way out. Each path carries significant risks. Each decision may trigger effects that go far beyond the battlefield. And perhaps this is the true nature of this moment. Not just a conflict between nations, but a turning point in the very structure of global power. There is a question that is rarely asked directly, but that in moments like this becomes inevitable. Why move forward in a conflict that presents so many evident risks? When strategic decisions seem to contradict technical analyses, military projections, and even internal recommendations, the need arises to look beyond the surface. And it is at this point that different interpretations begin to emerge. One of them is ancient, recurring, and at the same time, extremely human: the arrogance of empires. Throughout history, Dominant powers have often made the same mistake. After a sequence of victories or displays of strength, a perception of invulnerability emerges, a confidence that ceases to be based on data and becomes sustained by feeling. This pattern repeats itself in an almost predictable way. Rapid victories create an illusion of absolute superiority, and under this illusion, decisions begin to be made based on unrealistic expectations about one's own capacity. The problem is that reality rarely adjusts to this perception. And when confrontation happens in an environment different from the one for which the power was prepared, this confidence can turn into vulnerability. History offers multiple examples of this pattern. Powers that, at their peak, made decisions that accelerated their own decline, not because they lacked resources, but because they misread reality. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so delicate. The risk is not only in the conflict itself, but in the interpretation of it. If the scenario is underestimated, decisions may be made that deepen the problem. If it is overestimated, unnecessary reactions may be triggered. In both cases, the margin for error becomes minimal. At the same time, there is an element that rarely appears in official analyses: the human factor. Leaders are not purely rational entities. They are influenced by internal pressures, expectations, narratives, personal history. And these elements can shape decisions as much as data itself. This adds a layer of unpredictability that no model can fully anticipate. Because, in the end, geopolitical decisions are also human decisions. And humans, even at the highest levels of power, are subject to biases, to fears, to ambitions, to the need to maintain control. And when all of this is combined in a high-tension environment, the outcome becomes uncertain. Perhaps the most important point of all this is to understand that we are not only witnessing a possible conflict, we are witnessing a structural transition, the end of one logic and the beginning of another, a world where power is no longer concentrated in a single center, but distributed across multiple actors, each with their own interests, strategies, and limits. And this type of world tends to be more unstable, more dynamic, more difficult to predict. Which brings us to a final reflection. When global order begins to fragment, what replaces it? Is there a new model ready to take its place? Or are we entering a prolonged period of adjustment, where rules will be tested, challenged, and redefined? There is no clear answer, and perhaps that is exactly what defines this moment. Not certainty, but the absence of it. A silent transition, gradual, but deeply transformative. And like all transitions of this magnitude, its true impact will only be fully understood when it is already complete. Throughout this documentary, we explored evidence, accounts, and discoveries that attempt to explain this historical event. But one question remains unanswered. If everything happened exactly as we believe, then why are there so many contradictory records? Why do certain details seem to have disappeared from official history? Perhaps because this mystery has not yet been fully resolved, and perhaps there are still clues waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.